Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. And if you are watching us on YouTube, you know you can also catch us on myriad podcast platforms, essentially wherever fine podcasts are purveyed. And if you're listening to us on one of those podcasts and you want to see what's going on in the studio, you can check us out on YouTube, The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Please subscribe wherever you are. Leave us a review. Recommend us to your friends and family members and your family members' friends and your friends' family members. Just let folks know what's going on here at the Lunch Hour. Very excited to bring our guest on. His name is Clay Routledge. He is the Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab at Archbridge Institute. He's the co-editor of Profectus, a magazine on human progress and flourishing. As a leading expert in existential psychology, Clay's work focuses on helping people reach their full potential and build meaningful lives. He spent 2 decades in academia as a professor of psychology, professor of management, and distinguished professor of business. During that time, he taught undergraduate MBA and PhD courses in social and personality psychology, cultural psychology, research methods, and team leadership. He has also published more than 100 academic papers, co-edited 3 books, authored 2 books, and received numerous awards for his scholarly research and student mentorship. In 2002, Clay joined Archbridge Institute as Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab. Dr. Routledge, so glad you can join us here today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
So let's talk about this. You know, why don't humans reach their full potential? Why don't we flourish more?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I mean,
Yes.
there's a lot of reasons. Some of them are, things outside of our control. Some of them are like the societies we live in. This is one of the things that at the Archbridge Institute, why we care so much about things like economic freedom and people having more opportunities to reach their full potentials, because we want to remove the external barriers, of course, to that. But then once you do that, or assuming you can do that, maybe you can't remove every external barrier, but
Sure.
That's our goal. Assuming you can do that, there are a number of barriers within us too. Of our own fears and anxieties, our own laziness sometimes, our own lack of confidence. And so as a psychologist, I'm also very interested in that. And of course, it is a big question because those two things are often connected. We don't live completely independently from social influence and from the culture and society we live in. And so there's a constant, relationship between the world we live in and how that influences us and how we see ourselves in our own capacities. So we're very interested in both, the broader external barriers, but also our own internal psychological ones.
How did you become interested in this? And how did you become interested in the intersection of sort of this free market, limited government perspective and the psychology that's involved?
I mean, I've always been interested in the psychology component. Going back to when I was an undergraduate, I was very interested in the advanced human capabilities. Like, we have these brains that consume a lot of, use a lot of resources, energies, because we're thinkers, we're smart. And in some ways we're too smart for our own good, right? We can think about all sorts of things that terrify us and make us anxious. And so, with great intelligence comes great anxiety. And I was really, really interested in that capacity. But also really, I started to think about how we are social organisms too. So we don't just sit around and come up with our own ideas. We often cooperate, compete. We're influenced by others. We influence others, and people in social psychology are very interested in that, of course. But one thing I thought was often missing was we tended in our field, at least in psychology, to stop there. We didn't, and really humans exist in a larger national and international context too that implicates all sorts of other disciplines like economics. So I became really interested in how human psychology fits into this more complex web of societal functioning. And what I noticed in academia, at least in American academia, is a lot of that was missing, especially the free market perspective, because, as a number of surveys have shown, academia leans, very, very left wing. And I know a lot of people want to think that that doesn't influence, sort
Sure.
of the decision making that happens, but it does. If you don't have a balanced or more heterodox academy, you're often missing important perspectives. And so on the one hand, you have a lot of economists, especially outside of academia, that point out all the ways in which economic freedom has brought people out of poverty, has given people more opportunities around the world, and has really advanced human progress. While at the same time in academia, you have a lot of disciplines such as psychology and neuroscience, related behavioral sciences, that are doing a lot to understand the intricacies of the human mind and the human brain and all the great ways that makes us creative, but they weren't connecting it to this other piece. And so I really became interested in bringing those two things together.
Right. I mean, because a lot of folks don't understand that when you condition people to not want to do for themselves, then lo and behold, they're not going to want to do for themselves. So they sort of get mired. I mean, you can see sort of the result of, centuries of serfdom in Russia and what that does to the population in Russia. Whereas if you have a society like the United States, where you have this concept of the American dream, this idea of I've come to America or I'm in America and I'm going to do better for myself. If you then spend many, many decades, if not the better part of a century, conditioning those citizens to not want to do for themselves, well, the American dream is no longer somebody striving to do better for themselves. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's great you brought up that example, because, I mean, if you look at the field of like clinical psychology, like if somebody goes to a therapist and, says, I feel hopeless, I feel like I don't have any control over my life outcomes. I mean, one of the goals of a good therapist is to teach you to feel like you actually do have agency, that you have autonomy, that you're able to change your life. You can change how you think about things. And that's the first step to positively changing your life. Now scale that out to the societal level. What if you have a society that says, everything has to be top down. No, you don't get to decide. You're not responsible for yourselves. And so at the very micro level of clinical psychology, I think people, like professionals, understand the importance of freedom, of autonomy, of like people need to feel like they're in control of their destinies, and that they can pursue their dreams, such as the American dream, and that they have the ability to build a life that's meaningful, that's aspirational, and that, puts them, in the captain's chair. But, when that scales out at the, sociological level, often that's lost, and you start to see these ideas that are, at that broad level, we know are very harmful to economic growth, to entrepreneurship, to innovation, and all these things. But again, we're not seeing this connection. And in fact, unfortunately, I think more and more, if anything, I'm not the first person to point this out. We're teaching young people to be depressed. We're teaching them to be hopeless.
Well, it's not. Yes, that's right. It's this issue of, I was going to ask you which came first, the chicken or the egg in this. Mm-hmm. Because we spend a lot of time talking about the adolescent brain not being fully developed, especially in males until their mid-20s. Mm-hmm. But we know that 2 generations ago, the 18-year-olds were doing great things. The 18 to 25-year-olds were doing great things. Back in the past, if you were in your mid-20s, you were probably married, you probably had at least 2 kids, you were working a job, you were working towards a career. Now we're in an environment where you're allowed to stay on your parents' insurance until you're the age of 26. If you're a college student, your choices, your agency in terms of making rational adult choices are taken away from you. So is it a chicken or the egg? Is it that we're now understanding that the adolescent brain really doesn't develop, or have we as a society so coddled the adolescent that they're not reaching adulthood until their late 20s?
I mean, I think there's definitely something to the coddling hypothesis. Yeah. And for instance, I mean, there is research from psychologists like Jean Twenge who have shown that what's called the slow growth hypothesis, that the fewer kids we have, the more wealth we have in a society. Ironically, the more the more we protect and coddle kids, and we delay adolescence, through helicopter parenting, through these types of kind of micromanagement practices. Which on the one hand sounds like, oh, we're giving kids, more opportunities, a longer time period to be kids, to grow up or whatever. But at the same time, we're also seeing skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression among these younger groups, which suggests that what seems well-intentioned to protect children might actually be preventing them, or at least serving as a barrier to them, really becoming independent, autonomous, resilient young adults.
Right. This is where the work of Lenore Skenazy, the godmother of free range parenting, comes in so handy, because you talk about this. We always had the philosophy in our household of treating our kids as older than they actually were, and we would give them opportunities to voice input on things. We always had a rule in our house that if you don't like a decision that we've made as parents, you can challenge it. If you offer up a cogent argument, we'll consider it. We may not agree with you, but there's a possibility that we might actually agree with you. I've always felt that was the best way to go. But right, you're giving kids the investment a little bit more as adults. But you're correct, right? If you keep kids shut away, playing video games, if they're not out there, I'm sorry, I know I'm sort of all over the place here, but for me, like, I remember, it's the summertime as we're recording this. The summer of 1985, when I turned 14, was the greatest summer of my life. I wound up doing it was supposed to be a several-day backpacking trip through the high country in Yosemite. And we ran into some serious trouble on the trip, and we had to make a decision as a group. And the supervisors who were with us, they asked me what I thought at age 14. It was the first time I've really felt like an adult, that I had agency, that I had and that was so important to me moving forward. That's important for kids, isn't it? To get them invested.
Absolutely. Similarly, I remember when I was 13, I started a paper route, and I needed some money. I wanted to make money. I wanted to be able to do it. I wanted to save for a car so I could, get my driver's license when I turned 16. And now we know from a lot of data that young people are less likely to have teenage jobs. They're less likely to get driver's licenses.
Right.
So a lot of those, this isn't just me and you like waxing nostalgic here. There's a lot of evidence that, a lot of indicators, like young people aren't taking the steps towards independence through work and driving and other things that kind of gets them out on their own and able to make their own decisions and explore the world that they were in the past. And some people want to say, so what? Well, but again, by other indicators, we see, they're really struggling as they're emerging into adulthood.
Listen, I again, knowing from experience, watching two kids go off to college and watching how they interact with their classmates, and realizing that the longer a child was held in isolation during the pandemic, the more, I could drop a curse word here, but let's say the more challenged they were at going off to college in terms of dealing with other people and interacting with other people. And we're already in an environment in which, so much of that interaction is done via social media, so it takes out the interpersonal. But talk about this, about how the pandemic has impacted a lot of these things.
Yeah, I think that, if you look at a lot of trends, like the growing rates of anxiety, lower rates of childhood independence, those things were certainly happening pre-pandemic, but the pandemic really accelerated things because of like school closures, for instance. I've talked to a lot, I'm not a professor anymore, but I still talk to a lot of professors, and all the professors I talk to say since trying to reopen the university, since trying to get back in the classroom, it has been a real struggle. Students do not want to come back into the classroom. And a lot of universities are kind of caving to that and trying to make it to where students can do more online participation. And, to be clear, like I'm all for technological advancement.
Right.
You and I are able to have this conversation thanks
Absolutely.
to the internet. But I think something we're noticing is in terms of education, at least, the quality of interaction really goes down when these students aren't having in-person opportunities to listen, to talk, to engage their fellow students. They're not developing critical social skills for how to talk to people, for how to interact with professors, and I think this is just contributing to the growing anxiety problem.
I was teaching at the university level before the pandemic. I was teaching in the pandemic, and teaching in the classroom was much better than teaching via Zoom. I can speak from personal experience.
Yeah, I was too, and it was funny because you might have these stories too, but I was teaching during the pandemic. I was teaching in the business school, and we had these online classes, and sometimes students would log in like from their bed, or the best one was from somebody was actually going through the drive-through of like a McDonald's or something, and they were like and I was just like,
Yeah,
I guess credit
yes.
to him for doing two things at once. But
listen, I'm not going to say that I did this, but I may have done this where I was in a Zoom meeting. This is not in academia, obviously, because I couldn't do this if I was teaching. But I may have taken a screenshot of myself sitting, listening intently, and used that as my picture, and then ducked away for a little while. I may have done that. I can't. I won't say that. But let's get back to this though, which is talking about chickens and eggs. Had a conversation, and it was the beginning of the end of a friendship with the parent of a child that one of my kids was friends with. And the parent had posted to social media this story that was supposed to shock people. Well, we were driving up to the elementary school and there was a car speeding away. And my youngest child said to me in the car, well, gee, I hope there wasn't a mass shooting. And to which I replied to this person, I said, well, I think that really, all right, this was indelicate of me. I recognize this. I said, I think this says a little bit more about your parenting than it does about the general risk of mass shootings in schools, right? If it's like the old adage, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you are constantly telling your kids that there are going to be school shootings, your kid's first reaction is going to be, oh my God, there must have been a school shooting. I mean, I know that was an indelicate thing of me to say, but I think I was right, and I suspect you might agree with me on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we're very focused on at the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute is this constant drumbeat of negative, fear-provoking news and media, which is, again, going back to the mental health issues. I mean, that's one of the things, like a good clinical psychologist will try to, to help a patient understand is like, you can decide where you put your attention in life. Like you can focus on exaggerating the worst possible outcomes, or you can dedicate yourself to focusing on a more constructive and positive path. And I think you're absolutely right. Like if we're taking relatively low probability risks and making everyone think like they're happening all the time, then you're creating a recipe for anxious, depressed, pessimistic like people. And you're also contributing to this like growing victimhood mindset that, you're just going to be a victim your whole life as opposed to somebody who can really do great things.
Let's talk about this for a second, because again, and I want to get into what the Archbridge Institute does, but does a depressed, paranoid population, that population then becomes much easier for the powerful elites to control, doesn't it?
Yes, because what happens when people think about anxiety from a kind of adaptive point of view. Why humans or any organism would be anxious? Like anxiety is your brain telling you it's like an alarm, right? There's a reason to now's not the time to be super trusting, or now's not the time to go out there, take risks, interact with people. It's the time to lock down, to be defensive. And in those situations, people will often out of a desire for self-protection, easily turn over their freedom to authority. Say, protect me, right? Make the world safer. And that's understandable when there's actually like a legitimate threat. Like if we were being invaded right now as a country, by aliens are like a big topic right now, right? If there was an alien invasion, like on the movie Independence Day, then that might be the time to say, hey, now's not the best time for us to talk about these issues.
The sky is literally falling, falling. Go ahead.
We have to, somebody has to take charge and tell us what to do, and we have to come together and defend ourselves. But the problem is that's not happening. But when you create that mentality that we're constantly under threat, that you constantly should be afraid of your neighbors, afraid of everybody, that the world's going to end in 10 years because of climate change or whatever, then that does create that panic, that paranoia, that fear. That's really bad for freedom, and it's bad for everything we associate with freedom: economic growth, entrepreneurship, innovation. Things that really advance civilizational progress are going to be hard to do when people are anxious and depressed.
Let's talk about that for a second, because you raise a very important point that there's a difference between saying that something is a threat an existential threat and that something is a problem, right? A problem is something that needs to be solved, whereas an existential threat needs to be dealt with, and there's a certain severity. So I'll give you a good example, right? Climate change. Now, we could agree, we don't have to have the debate over whether or not climate change is man-made, but assuming that we agree that climate change was man-made and that something needed to be done about it, the question then becomes, what do we do about it as humans? Right. When you say that it's an existential threat, then you look at the government to provide that solution. When you say that it's a problem that we need to address, we can find solutions to that problem. And I think you're right. Innovation, then that's what it gets driven, right? You build a better mousetrap and the world beats a path to your door. You want to create situations where people are building better mousetraps without saying that mice are an existential threat. Right.
That's right. Yeah.
But expound on that, and talk a little bit about the work that the Archbridge Institute does.
Yeah. So, sticking with the climate example, and a lot of people who are, I think, in the, even like center left, center right. I mean, there are people, I think, who are trying to approach the climate issue very constructively and say, and they don't agree on the solutions necessarily. Some of us lean more towards like free market solutions, innovation, competition. Sure. Other people lean more towards regulatory solutions. But I think you can have a healthy debate in an environment in which you're like, this is a challenge, but let's not like overly panic. Because what happens when people overly panic is, well, only so many people are going to overly panic, and they're going to insist on like something very, very radical, which isn't going to be very economically viable or practical for most people. And then other people are just going to like not want to engage at all, because they're like, well, if you're going to be that radical and say the world's going to end in 10 years, then why should I bother carrying it all in the first place?
Right.
And so you're not going to make any progress, or it's going to be hard to make progress in that environment. So I think you're right. I think it's important that people, are calm-headed and rational and recognize that, we can accept challenges and move forward with that optimistic spirit, which anxiety and fear are not going to be the best recipes for that. At the Archbridge Institute, we're very focused on these issues, right? It's not necessarily like environmental policy or anything like that, but we're focused on the broader cultural conversations around human progress and flourishing. And we see these narratives that we've been talking about, like these pessimistic, hopeless, basically dystopian narratives that everything's falling apart, that, the environment's horrible, that racism's never been worse, that, pick your issue, everything's apparently, according to some people, just getting worse. And we're saying, well, that's completely in conflict with facts, for one, by many indicators. Lots of things are getting better. It's not to say we don't have problems or don't have challenges, or there aren't some issues that are getting worse. But on the whole, there's a lot of things to celebrate, especially in the Western world and in the United States. And how do we build on that? How do we make it to where people have more opportunity, fewer barriers? But critically, how do we do this in like a positive, aspirational way that has, from our institute's perspective, that's freedom and opportunity at the core of that.
Let's talk about this, because these are all themes, risk and crisis-driven policy and things like that have all been themes on this show. The issue of empowerment versus disempowerment, right? Policy actions that serve to empower people to act on their own behalf, and then policy decisions that disempower people. I know you and I are in agreement that empowerment is better. Talk about why empowerment and empowering people to act on their own behalf produces better results.
I think there's a number of reasons. One I've really been thinking about a lot lately is how much of these debates around like the best way to do things, like take the student loan issue as one example. A lot of the focus you see that I think is well-intentioned is just focused on an outcome, right? It's like, well, people have this debt. We don't want them to have it, right? But by focusing on a particular outcome, that's a very like static, kind of like one-off idea. One thing I've seen, and there's been some recent research on this, is the people who they were able to do this in almost like a comparative, like experimental way, because there are people that have student loans that weren't through the federal government, and so they weren't, suspended. And then there are people that had them suspended by the government. And the people who had them suspended actually have taken on more debt. Like they didn't.
Yes.
You've probably seen that. And so I think that's a good example of when, even well-intentioned, if you focus on an outcome, it fails to capture the human element of that. And we're not static. Like we're always in motion. Like, and there's always a tomorrow. And so you can do something that sounds nice, like let's give this person some money or some relief or something. But how does that energize or mobilize them to do for themselves in the future? So I think there's that, there's that component of it too. Like, let's erase student debt. Well, then what? Like people are going to take more debt tomorrow. And so that doesn't actually help from like, you have to take in that human perspective. And in addition to that, there's something I think less quantitative, like that's more, more qualitative about the human condition and what we really want deep down. And people want to feel meaningful. Like they want to feel like they're in charge of their own lives and that they actually matter in the world, that they're making contributions. And I think one of the things that's often missed in our public policy discussions is that very existential human component, which is, these are real people that have, and they want, most people don't want to be taken care of and feel like they're dependent on others. They want to feel like what they're contributing in some way. And I feel like that's often neglected in these conversations is what does it mean to be a human organism on this planet, and what gives us fulfillment, what gives us meaning?
You can go through from issues of criminal justice reform to elder care to so many other things, and that's a thread that runs through all of it. On the issue of intentions, real quick, I have a phrase that I like to use, which is the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. Because again, policies can be incredibly well-intentioned, but at some point in time, the reality of the situation sets in. But let's talk about this issue of value, because I literally had a conversation this morning with one of my best friends. She has an elderly parent. Her mother took a spill and had tripped over a vacuum, and my friend was like, "Mom, why are you vacuuming?" And she's like, "Well, the cleaning people, they don't get under the furniture. They don't get behind the furniture." And she's like, "Well, they would, if you pay them a little more, you do this." The point is, her mother, at the end of the day, wanted to feel wanted. I know with my mother, she wants to feel wanted and useful. You're right. There's something innate about that. Actually, before we get to this, because I've just opened this up, so many of our perceptions of life around us are related to those innate feelings. Like property rights is something that I spend a lot of time talking about. It was a great issue of great passion of mine. And I've always said that our sense of property rights is born out of our innate territorial instincts. Talk about our innate instincts and how they sort of play into how we interact in general society.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I focus on, because I'm what's called an existential psychologist, so I'm very interested in what are the deep, questions that humans uniquely ask, what uniquely drives us. And one of the things that cultural psychologists have observed, and the cultural is important because people will sometimes say, well, you think that because you're an American or you're a Westerner, but it turns out humans all over the world, regardless of what type of culture they live in, what type of government they have a longing for autonomy. They want to feel self-determined. So there's this great theory in psychology called self-determination theory. And what these researchers have documented is that it doesn't matter if you're in a collective society like East Asia or an individualistic society like in the United States. People want to feel like they're in charge of their lives, that they're self-determined. Now, in collectivist societies, that might manifest differently because they might have a higher value on cultural harmony. But even then, what individuals they don't want to be coerced into cultural harmony. They want to say, I've decided that I share this value. And so that is one example of humans want to feel autonomous. It starts from an early age when kids start exploring the world. This goes back to our conversation about why childhood independence is so important. It's people will say humans are sheep, we're conformist, and there's a certain level of social comparison where that's true, but that's only part of the story. Yes, we look to others and we copy others and we're influenced by others. We also have a longing to explore, to expand the self, to learn new things, to grow, to develop our individual interests. And so I think that's increasingly neglected, but a universal feature of the human experience.
It gets down to, the truism of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and the issue of natural rights that come from God or a Creator that we're just born with. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, and one thing I think people misunderstand is when they hear that, they assume that somehow that's in conflict with our social nature, but it really isn't. Again, looking at this, this research in self-determination theory, they found that another thing that's universal is our desire for relatedness, to connect with others. Right. And so these two things aren't in opposition. You can have a sense of I want to be an individual with individual rights and opportunities, while at the same time being part of a social fabric that gives my life purpose. And those things are not in conflict at all.
I appreciate that, because it gives an evolutionary biology sort of aspect to the creation of just law, right? The idea that you have a person is born, they have these feelings of self-determination, they have all of their rights intact. It's when they start interacting with another human who also has those rights, and when those interactions come into conflict, right? Man's a social creature, they're going to interact with people are going to interact with other people, and that's where just law is going to be born out of. I think that's I love that. I'm sorry, I'm putting words in your mouth, but I love that view of the world there.
Yeah, and you made an important point too, which is because I do a lot of research on what I refer to as existential agency, which is people's perception that they have the ability, they have the power within them to live meaningful lives. This work was very much influenced by Viktor Frankl's writing about his experience in a concentration camp. And he made this point about psychological freedoms, no matter what conditions you live in, you still no one can control your thoughts, right? You can decide how to be, even in the worst circumstances. And he gave examples of people giving away their last piece of bread, even though they were clearly dying. And so he was talking about the moral fabric of the human being is you ultimately at the end of the day, you still have some power, some freedom, regardless of the circumstances you're in. And one of the things that I've observed is when people understand their own agency, as you note, then they start to see that other people have that too. And if I can be responsible for myself, then other people can be responsible for themselves. So I think it increases, our capacity to respect human dignity when we feel that sense of that autonomy and self-determination.
Let's talk about entrepreneurship for a second, because I've long said that the entrepreneur's dream is the American dream is the entrepreneur's dream, and I mean that in a general sense that to be able to me the entrepreneur's dream is you take an idea and you make it real, and you better your life and the lives of others around you by making that idea real. To me, that's an essential element of the American dream. But talk about the outside factors that deal with that and mess with your head. So I was a small business lobbyist for many years, and I've talked to folks about how if they'd known about all the red tape that got in their way, they might not have done it all over again. I'm sorry, because I got far afield. It is important for people to have examples in their lives around them of the folks who have made those entrepreneurial choices, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean I think that's one of the key features of when I was talking about these cultural world views that are highly negative and anxious. There's research, for instance, that the more anxious people feel, the less likely they are to engage in entrepreneurial activities. And so where does anxiety come from? Well, it comes from what we just talked about, which is if people feel the world's going to end or everything's horrible, I don't have a chance, nothing in life is fair, I can't trust my neighbors. That's not a culture in which you feel like it's a good idea to put yourself out there, take a big financial risks and start a business or engage in other types of entrepreneurial activities. So it doesn't mean people don't. It just means that creates a climate that's hostile to entrepreneurship. So a lot of times we think about economic, and kind of policy things that are hostile to entrepreneurship, which we focus on at Archbridge too, like occupational licensing. Like the government can certainly put up major barriers to people realizing their entrepreneurial ambitions. But in addition to that, we take kind of a more holistic approach, and there can be cultural, social, and psychological barriers too. Even in a perfect climate for perfect economic and regulatory climate for entrepreneurship, people still need to feel inspired. They still need to feel driven to go out there and want to make a positive difference in their community and to bring something to the market that they feel is important.
And to be really clear, right, entrepreneurship isn't necessarily about making money. Being entrepreneurial in terms of ideas and generating ideas, that's also an aspect of this. Let's pull it back. So how did you get interested in these issues? What brought you to become an existential psychologist, and then to teach, and then to join Archbridge?
Well, I think I was always interested in what is it that's unique about humans compared to other organisms. And obviously we're smart, and you see a lot of that focus on intelligence and our neurological capacities. But I was also interested, and it isn't just that we're smart. Like we have this need for meaning. Of course, that comes from our intelligence. But we're not just rational computer. I mean, you could think of us as smart and being robot-like, right? Or Vulcan-like on Star Trek or something. But we're not, right? We're spiritual. Like we like art. We spend a lot of time and energy in things that aren't necessarily practical, but they elevate us in some way. We are emotional. We have love. We have passion for things, and those are just as important features of the human experience. I think is the more rational kind of cognitive advancements. And so I was really interested in that, and then how that connects to, well, how do we like to spend our energy? What do we like to do with our lives? What's most important to us? What gives us meaning? And obviously some of the things we've talked about, people's ability to pursue their aspirations and their goals and to reach their full potential. But a lot of what gives us meaning is our families, our relationships, building these communities in which we feel, again, like we are somehow making a significant difference in the lives of others. And really that's the key of the existential experience, I think.
So, I think it's always important for folks to understand a little bit more about our guests. And obviously this work that you do has great value. The work at the Archbridge Institute has great value, great meaning. But when you're not doing this kind of work, how do you busy yourself? How do you maximize your potential outside of your work? What are some of your outside interests?
A big outside interest for me is fitness. I wouldn't consider myself a natural athlete by any means, but I very much enjoy exercise, lifting weights, running, hiking, doing those types of things. And one of the things that I think is a big area of interest for me, which is outside of work but also connects to work, is how important our engagement in those physical activities is for all aspects of our lives. I mean, we're spending more and more time online. Mm-hmm. All of us are, but we are an organism that really thrives when we get outside, when we interact with others, when we move our bodies, and so I am interested in that, at the professional level of being a psychologist. But that very much a lot of my free time I try to spend outside and doing those sorts of things. But I'm also, I love science fiction movies. I like, what's funny is I'm a very optimistic person, and I'm very bullish on America. But I do love dystopian science fiction. I think there's something about seeing people's imaginations of worst case scenarios that is entertaining, but I don't think those are prescriptions for our society.
Are you like me? And see, here's the interesting thing. I didn't even know we were going to go here. But are you like me? I have a real hard time with dystopian fiction that doesn't, I think, accurately reflect, again, humans as being social, humans' capacity for cooperation, the concept of spontaneous order. Right. So one of the things that one of the movies that I love that I know a lot of people hate is The Postman, because The Postman has this aspect of spontaneous order and people coming together and banding together. One of the things I've watched all of the Walking Dead series, and one of my problems with that is that there is not enough cooperation. There is some, obviously, you have some, but to me, maybe I'm a naive optimist in all of this, but I think that, you know, in that kind of a disaster, more people would come together to try to solve the problems that are around them than would be at each other's throats. I suspect you might be the same, but where do you stand in terms of your dystopian fiction and how this is reflected? Yeah,
no, I think you're making great points. I mean, one of the things I like about dystopian fiction is when there's a very much like a redemptive story, right. You know, story arcs. It's like, you know, even in the worst case, even in like ones that involve like some kind of like climate disaster that I think is not, you know, super realistic, what I like seeing is like the point you make is like, well, this is a test of humans, right? This is a test. What will they do in this crisis? And obviously for like entertainment value, you know, oftentimes they try to make, you know, things look really, really horrible. But I do like the story. I do really, really like the stories in which it shows the power of human ingenuity, the power of human aspiration, connection. One of my favorite movies, actually, I think it's not a dystopian movie; it's a science fiction movie. Is The Martian? I don't know if you've
sure, 100%. On my top 10, without a doubt.
Yeah,
sorry,
and I think it does. I think it does a great job of showing, like, you know, humans. Well, obviously, there's the main character, Mark Watney. I think that's his name, right?
Yeah, that's his name.
Who he has to be innovative and use all of his science expertise and resilience. But then you also see his teammate. You know, and I guess I don't want to give any spoilers in case anyone hasn't seen this.
No, that's all right. Yeah. You know, we have the rule that if it's been more than a year, you can go ahead and give away the ending. He gets home, by the way. Yes,
he does, and it shows like people coming together. His, like his crew, like people, scientists from around the world. And so, yeah, I'm with you. I really, really like those stories, or anything that just shows like human grit and resilience, and like I really like survivor types of stuff.
Oh, listen, you know, it's funny. I became a huge fan of that TV show Man Tracker. It was, not everybody saw it. You know, two people, they go off into the woods somewhere. They have to get from point A to point B in 36 hours, and they've got a guy, a professional tracker, tracking them. My only problem with the end of The Martian, and I said this is the first time it's very casual. My only problem with the end of The Martian is Sean Bean's character, who was like the director of operations, the one who leaked the plans to go and rescue Watney to the crew. Yeah. He's punished at the end. You find him later on the golf links. And I think, you know something, they should have kept him in his job. They should have made up with the director of NASA's character. I had a problem with that. The Book of Eli. I don't know if you've seen that one with Denzel Washington, right? Where he ultimately is bringing a Bible to a group of people who are trying to rebuild civilization. I'm sorry, I know we've gone down a really weird rabbit hole here. but right, because if you look at human history and you look at the most trying of times, yes, we've been barbarous to each other. Yes, Rome fell. But as Rome fell, you had small groups of humans coming together to save various aspects of human knowledge so that human knowledge wasn't lost, right? You had the monks in Ireland, you know, saving so much of classical history. That, to me, is the lesson that should be drawn. Not that Rome fell. I mean, we could talk about the despotism, but that people came together to solve the problem. I think you would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's very much like my view of human flourishing, which is, of course, what we do at the Human Flourishing Lab. Yeah. It really is that kind of active state. Again, you know, I think a lot of people think of like a snapshot of outcomes. Like, we want society to look like this, you know. Yeah. Which that's not. I mean, if you think about an organism, it's constantly moving. We're constantly growing and developing. And so, to me, like a big aspect of that, and what taps into what you're capturing here, is like our potential for redemption, our potential to learn from our mistakes, to come together, to improve the world. And to me, having that more like active, dynamic view of flourishing is a better characterization of the human species than sort of any one snapshot of a particular time and place.
Dr. Routledge, how do folks find out more about the good work that you do and the work of the Archbridge Institute?
You can look online, just, if you, thanks to advances in technology, you can just Google Archbridge Institute or the Human Flourishing Lab. We have websites, and, on the Human Flourishing Lab website, we've got a nice little video series that introduces like what we're doing, and, it's just a minute long for each video and some of the specific topics we're focused on. And we also publish, reports. We do surveys and what Americans think about different things like patriotism. So there's a lot of good content on those, and we're working to develop resources so people can all the things we were talking about to help people find more positive, aspirational stories, narratives that they can use to improve their lives and improve the world around them.
Well, I will go and check it out. Dr. Clay Routledge, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Our guest has been Clay Routledge, the director of the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute. I'm Andrew Langer. I am your host. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Go check us out. Leave us a review. Subscribe to the podcast. If you're watching us, listen to us. If you're listening to us, go watch us on YouTube. As I said, I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.